Welcome. I'm so glad you've joined us for this exciting presentation entitled How GIS Can Inform Your Public Messaging, and it's presented by Carmela Birdie. Carmela is a Senior Geographic Information Systems Analyst in the Decision and Infrastructure Sciences Division at Argonne National Laboratory. Her background in geospatial systems and emergency management allows her to develop geographic decision-making tools for sponsors such as FEMA and other agencies within DHS. She currently provides geospatial analysis, creates geospatial toolsets, and provides cartographic support to a variety of sponsors. And prior to her position at Argonne, she spent 8 years at DuPage County, Illinois, supporting county government and the local Emergency Operations Center, the Sheriff's Office, and the Health Department. She holds a Master's in Geographic Information Sciences. It is now my pleasure to introduce Carmela Birdie. Carmi, the virtual stage is now yours.
Hi, everyone. My name is Carmela Birdie, and I am a Senior GIS Analyst at Argonne National Laboratory. And today I'm going to talk to you about GIS and how it fits into the emergency management space and how it can help inform public messaging. So what we're going to talk about today is I'm going to talk a little bit about what an overview of GIS is for those who are unfamiliar or just want a refresher. And then we'll start to talk about how it fits into emergency management operations and public messaging as a whole. So there might be some new information to you up front. There might be some new information to you at the back, but we'll see, what we chat about today. And then, of course, we'll do questions and answers at the end. So for those who are unfamiliar, what is a GIS? A GIS is really a system that creates, manages, analyzes, and maps all types of spatial data. So a GIS really connects spatial data to a map. It's putting a point and referencing it to the Earth's surface. We are studying geography. We are studying why things are where they are. And we are also able to connect all of that spatial data. So where is a park? Where is a roadway? With a lot of pieces of descriptive or non-spatial data. And this is what provides us a foundation for mapping and analysis that is used in science and really almost any industry. GIS helps us understand patterns, relationships, geographic context, and the benefits of this are really countless. It provides improved communication and efficiency. I think it provides for better management, better decision-making. It's a really, really powerful tool. And there's sort of the generic definition written up on the screen, which I'm not going to read to you out loud. But I will kind of just build on this for one moment because we are talking about a computer system. And really a GIS, a Geographic Information System, is a database management system. And it specializes in the displaying and analyzing of spatial data. So again, that's the data that has a specific relationship to a point on the Earth's surface. I think what's important to remember about this definition is that we can understand and map and view the absolute and relative location of features on the Earth's surface, but again, also bring in that non-spatial attribution or characteristics. And we'll talk more about that in just a little bit. So what does a GIS do? Well, hundreds of thousands of organizations in pretty much every field you can think of use GIS to make maps, to help communicate or perform analysis, to share information, to really solve complex problems around the world. And to be, I think, maybe a little hyperbolic, it is changing the way we work. It is changing the way the world works. And I think it is one of those tools that sort of creeps its way into every single industry without folks knowing that it's showing up there. You will find GIS referred to in a lot of different ways. So for instance, I'm saying GIS, Geographic Information Systems. You might hear geospatial, you might hear location science, you might hear point-based analysis, you might hear market analysis. All of that is really saying we're trying to understand what's happening in a region, what's happening in a geographic area, and we're using our computer-aided system, our database management system, to do that. GIS provides a toolkit that gives us the ability to view and model that data. Human beings are really visual creatures. We possess an innate ability to visualize patterns. And sometimes patterns can take us a very long time to identify if the only information we have is in a spreadsheet or in a textbook, and we have to maybe read through it or scan through it that way. But when we start to put that information into charts, graphs, maps, that is sort of an instantaneous switch for a lot of people. Things become more visually engaging, and people start to the neurons start firing, and we start connecting what we're seeing on the map versus what the data is telling us. And we can do this in a lot of different ways. I mean, it's not just plotting points or markers, it's not just color coding locations. We can use heat maps, we can perform density analyses, we can overlay multiple different types of geographic data to provide a picture or a story of what is happening in our communities. And so I know I sound like really excited, and I am excited because I just think a GIS tool is super powerful and a really great way to provide decision makers with the ability to make sort of snap judgments based on what they're seeing on their maps. And I'll take it even one step further, because our GIS systems, our computer systems, these are not static. They really allow us to do querying. They allow us to pull the data out of our database management system and bring it to the surface so we can learn more about it. And we can start to see patterns, we can start to analyze the data, and we can start to dig deeper by doing those queries than we could if it was just in a spreadsheet or just in a graph or that kind of thing. So GIS, bottom line, does a lot of things. This graphic on my slide here, right, is showing some roadways. It's showing some attribute tables, and then it's showing, what that might look like if we started to map that. So I think it's just, kind of a lot of folks think GIS, static maps, these are the maps I put in my report or my PowerPoint, but it goes beyond that. And we are going to talk about that today. So who does GIS, right? There are varying levels of GIS specialization, just like there probably are in most industries. But I think it's interesting to note, and something I will bring up to you all, and that is that almost everyone uses GIS in their daily life. So I have my little pyramid here, which highlights how a person might move up the ranks of a GIS practitioner. But I kind of want you to pay special attention to the bottom of the pyramid, because this is where all of you all fit in. This is where the average user sits. You are maybe comfortable using your phone to help you navigate somewhere. You may use Google Maps or Apple Maps to get a sense of your surroundings. You track your packages using UPS or FedEx. You go online to find the nearest pharmacy or grocery store or whatever it is. And, we might dig into certain things around our communities that really impact us at sort of that bottom level of our pyramid here. That said, there are a lot of people that are GIS adjacent. And I think that the emergency management community as a whole falls into this GIS adjacent category. So, for example, before I was at Oregon, I worked in local government for about 8 years. In that time, I supported our sheriff's office and our emergency operations center. Neither of these offices had their own GIS staff located, within their departments. Instead, there was usually someone, maybe a fireman, maybe an officer, maybe a PIO who knew a little bit of GIS or had heard of GIS, or the chief said, you are going to be the GIS person now. That was kind of in these groups, and they relied on the broader county GIS staff in order to provide more advanced support. But this second row of my pyramid here is very, very important, because you all are the boots on the ground people in a community and in a jurisdiction. And you all are the ones that are, dealing with maybe the public or the emergency response or whatever it is. And so my goal today, and always, is to get these GIS adjacent folks comfortable with the thought of what GIS is, comfortable talking to the GIS staff that they do have available to them, and comfortable to explore the possibilities of what a GIS can do for you. We'll talk a little bit more about how to have those conversations if you're not a GIS person, in just a little bit. So keep that in mind. We'll talk about how to approach those conversations. And I've talked for like 2 minutes now on my first 2 rows of my pyramid, but I haven't even gotten to the actual GIS users yet. These are the regular people that are using GIS in their everyday life. They're slightly GIS adjacent. At the bottom there. And then we move up and we get to the GIS technician level. This is a basic GIS user, but someone who does GIS as a career. They might create maps, they might clean and create data. They're not doing a ton of spatial analyses, they're not doing a ton of modeling, but they're able to provide good information about what exists within a community and maybe what the population looks like. As we start to move up to the last couple rows in our pyramid here, we get to things like specialists, we get to things like analysts, and these are the folks that are going to do much more in the way of investigation. They're going to do much more pattern detecting, much more decision making. And in my opinion, this is a really fun place to be. Because these, I think, are the folks you're going to be wanting to work with the most, as you're looking to incorporate GIS into your emergency management operations. The the tiniest little bubble there at the top of these pyramids, these are developers and scientists. They're a little bit more rare, but again, they're going to be able to do some amazing things for you. These are the folks that are already doing amazing things. They're doing risk analysis over at FEMA. They're doing modeling for hazard support. They're doing all sorts of really cool sciencey things. That said, maybe the average emergency manager doesn't need that level of support, but you do need some GIS support, at least in my humble opinion. And so we will talk about that in just a minute. How do you use GIS? Normally, I would pause here and we'd take some questions and we'd talk about how we use GIS in our everyday life, but this is a little bit pre-recorded, so I will start listing out maybe a few things that I've heard from folks that are not GIS folks, but they still do use GIS in their everyday life. And that is, right, they use Waze to check traffic. They use Google Maps to get themselves around. They, pull up directions before they go to a place. And in the last few years, we take these things for granted now, because 10 years ago, my phone could not do any of these things. My phone could not navigate me from one side of the state to the other. My phone couldn't find the nearest pharmacy or the nearest grocery store. GIS capabilities are expanding at an just obscene rate. They are, as computer processing gets cheaper, as hardware gets cheaper, chip shortages notwithstanding, as all of this stuff sort of becomes more commonplace, GIS capabilities become more commonplace. And we start to take those things for granted. So think back, right, to the last time you got in your car and actually pulled out a paper atlas. When was that? Because I don't even have a paper atlas in my car anymore, which is terrible. And I know a lot of people that wouldn't even be able to read one if they had one or if they had to. So we're becoming really, really, really reliant on these technologies. And I think it would be remiss for us to not start to better understand the technologies that we are becoming super, super reliant upon. The geospatial sciences are expanding every single day. So I can't think of an industry that doesn't really use GIS in some respect. I mean, we see it in retail when we're talking about how to find where a new store should be located, a new McDonald's, a new Walgreens. We see it in real estate, right? When we're talking about where should we build homes, where should we build commercial properties, where should we, you know, uh, whatever it is, build whatever it is. We see it in planning, right? Where do we put our new freeway? Where do we put our new public transit stops to service people? Where, where do we build in order to have, a less ecological impact on the environment or a less disastrous impact on our local community, whatever it is. So it's GIS the geospatial sciences are really just truly integrated into almost everything we do. And I want to, take a second to talk about the geographic in geographic information systems, because what that means is that we need to think about geographic problems with some spatial thinking. Using our GIS, we connect data with geography. We need to understand geography is the study of why things are where they are. We need to understand why things are where they are, but what belongs where. And we can't do that if we don't look at things from a geographic context, from a geographic mindset. I could talk for ages about, the different industries that use GIS. Obviously, agriculture, forestry, environmentalists, that type of stuff. But, I mentioned already real estate, land planning, that business side of things. But the military and defense, very heavy GIS users. They care about location intelligence, logistics management, satellite imagery. Our local law enforcement uses it for investigative analyses, in-vehicle mapping, predictive policing. And, for us in emergency management, we use GIS for public safety. So we are just living through a pandemic, right? And how many of you guys have seen things like the Johns Hopkins virus dashboard or other maps that show vaccination rates in the states or, the number of coronavirus cases in different areas? All of that is done through GIS. And we understand the patterns and the movement of that spread of disease or whatever it is using science, using modeling, and we display it visually with our mapping products, our web applications, our dashboards, so that people can explore, examine, and deep dive themselves into the data of interest. Before the pandemic occurred, I think a lot of emergency management officials were, part of their planning was around, maybe a pandemic, maybe an epidemiological event of some sort. And at the time, I think a lot of us really thought that, we need to worry about where we might dispense medication from. So we need to think about locations where we might want to put a point of dispensary, or we might think about locations where we can distribute goods and services, or where we can set up mobile hospitals. I don't think we thought too much at the local level, at least, about spread, about the movement of the disease, and about those types of things. And now that we've kind of lived through this worst case scenario, I think we're going to see a lot of improvements in using GIS to help us understand all of those things and how we can better prepare for them in an emergency management space going forward. So again, I have some bullets on this slide here. I hate reading slides to people, so I'll let you guys read those if you will. But you know, again, the geospatial sciences are everywhere. They are all around us. I'm going to take a moment to, you know, break things down to its most basic level here. GIS is for the simple things, and at the beginning of the day, we're really creating geographic data. We're assigning point locations to a spot on the Earth's surface. We're doing things like digitizing building footprints, digitizing parks, marking where roadways exist, and then we're, you know, managing that data, making sure it stays up to date and accurate, and that it is correct. And then we sort of move on and we begin, you know, our analyses and our assessments. And this is where we start to pull out those patterns. This is where we start to analyze our data and, you know, really get down into the root of the geographic questions that we're asking, into that study of why things are where they are. The GIS credo, you know, if you will, the geography credo. And so I think it's really important, you know, to remind folks that we're studying geography, and we are using our GIS to answer geographic regional questions. And then the last thing we're going to do with all of our data is we're going to display it. And so, you know, I've talked about static maps. I have talked a little bit about web applications. And I think sometimes folks think like the display part could be the boring part because it's just a static map. It's just an image or a PDF. But it doesn't have to be. And in fact, you know, the last 5 years or so, we've really moved away from static maps, and we are looking at GIS as, you've probably heard the term software as a service. You know, we're looking at GIS as a service. And so we can serve it up in cloud-based applications. We can have it be something that the public can access or just emergency managers can access. It could be credentialed, but folks can go in and they can visit a web application. They can turn layers on and off. They can click on a point to get some pop-up information about it. They can zoom in, zoom out, pan around. And so this is where things get really exciting. And this is where I think you're going to find the most bang for your buck as emergency managers. I'm going to skip a little bit. I'm going to go a little bit fast here because we're talking about spatial data. Again, data that's represented by a point on the Earth's surface. And with our GIS, we're able to tie a point, school, park to a particular place on the Earth's surface. And all of this data that you see on my slide here is types of spatial data that people might think of when they think of GIS maps or things like that. And I want to just step back for 1 second and say all of this data doesn't just exist. Someone has to create it. Someone has to build it. And that is where your GIS analysts, that is where your GIS technicians, they come into play. Because we have to start somewhere. We have to start with things like a list of addresses or maybe precise bounding coordinates of a building, building footprints, that type of thing. And we can do a lot with the aid of satellite imagery because we can digitize trees or hydrants or, you know, trace outlines of buildings and all of that. But the data needs to be maintained. The data needs to be updated. The data needs to be, you know, proofread, for lack of a better term, QA, QC'd. And if that's hard for you to wrap your head around, stop back and think about your own jurisdiction, think about your own community, and think about how many times in your community things have changed, right? We build new subdivisions, we build new office parks, we build new schools, we tear down old schools, or we, you know, conserve land and mark it as, protected or historical. All of those things are constantly changing the makeup of our community. And we need to understand how to keep track of all of that. And your GIS person is going to be the one that does it for you. So I have this quote on my slide here: 80% of data is spatial data. And this is kind of a joke among the GIS community because it showed up in an article one time, and 80% of data is spatial data, and no one really knows where it came from. No one can find the source of this quote. But this slide is just going to kind of explain the difference between spatial data and non-spatial data. Spatial data, again, point on the Earth's surface. Non-spatial data, however, is I think what makes DBMS supporting GIS super accessible. Because not only do you know where your building is located, you know how many occupants it has, which is non-spatial data. You might know who owns the building, and you might know when, the last time they paid their taxes. All of those other sort of characteristics about that parcel or building are non-spatial, but we're tying them into that place on the Earth's surface. And so that's where we're starting to be able to build out queries, build out questions, understand what's happening to that spatial data that makes it important, that makes us understand why that piece of whatever it is where it is. Okay. So what does GIS do for emergency managers, and what can emergency management look for in a GIS? A GIS can help emergency management in a number of different ways. And I think it's safe to say we probably all know, the main phases of the emergency management cycle: preparedness, mitigation, response, recovery. And GIS really has a part to play in every single one of those phases. For example, a GIS can be really useful in tabletop exercises or other training scenarios. I'm currently working to help the County of San Diego with their regional tabletop exercise. And we're using a GIS to provide one of those web mapping applications I talked about for this training, so that users and participants in the exercise can come in and they can see exactly their jurisdiction. They can see the impact of the exercise scenario. So this is the area of impact, and they can see what assets or critical infrastructure might fall within the impacted area. So they can start doing things like prioritizing response, prioritizing recovery in response to the exercise. We use GIS for our planning. We can make recommendations for mitigation efforts. So for example, if we know that a particular area in our community almost always seems to flood after, excessive rainfall, we can use GIS to kind of map the historical excessive flooding that has occurred in that area, and maybe develop techniques we can use to either respond to that flooding or think about planning and infrastructure projects which would stop that excessive rainfall from causing flooding in the first place. And so I hope as I'm talking and kind of giving you these real world examples, it becomes a little bit obvious how we can use GIS in not just the planning and mitigation, but also the response and recovery phases. We can use our GIS to target areas of concern in terms of where we might need to stage supplies, where we might need to stage efforts for search and rescue, where we might need to do outreach to special needs of populations or things like that. And with recovery, we can use the GIS to help us prioritize areas which we might need to respond to or prioritize for recovery sooner rather than later. I've said this before and I'll say it again: as an emergency manager, you know your jurisdiction the best. You know your community the best. But if you had access to a tool that really allowed you to take some of your local knowledge to provide the facts that you need to back up that information that's all in your head, I think you'd find yourself in a much better place. You'd number one, be able to back up your position with the higher ups if it becomes necessary. And again, in your community where the nursing homes are, where the hospitals are located. You might understand, this neighborhood, 75% of the population, doesn't speak English. And we can get down to that, level of detail for you. So you might say, yes, I know this area doesn't speak English, and I know they're mostly Spanish speakers, but we can start to bring in real data from the United States Census and other outreach efforts and say, yeah, not only is, we knew the population was English as a second language, but we didn't realize it was 80% or 90% of that population. So that means our messaging and our outreach really needs to be bilingual. It needs to be in English and Spanish. So GIS is really, it's more than just mapping. It's an analytical tool, it's data management, it's visualization. We can use it for situational awareness. We can use it to help us identify ideal locations for positioning assets. And I don't think I need to, beat the drum anymore. It's just a really, really important tool, I think, for emergency managers to keep in their back pocket and to use as needed to understand their community. So how can you engage with your GIS support staff? If you're lucky, you might have someone in your EOC that does GIS or knows GIS. If you're not so lucky, you might be having to rely on folks in either a municipality office or, your county or state level or whatever it is. That's okay. I don't necessarily think that every single jurisdiction needs a GIS person. But I think what they need is the ability to understand the benefits of GIS and what it can bring to the table. So I've talked a little bit about web mapping applications, how that's a really, sort of a new tool to put GIS in the hands of decision makers. But what I would encourage you to do is reach out to your GIS staff in order to do a couple things. So think of it as kind of a fact-finding mission. You want to understand what types of data they have access to, and you also want to understand where there might be limitations. So there might be data gaps in your community that you are unaware of, or that your GIS person is unaware of, but you actually might already have. And so that connection, making that connection can be really, really valuable because you're going to know stuff, they're going to know stuff. And when you put your head together, you're going to get a more complete picture. In my experience, most GIS people just really want to help. We love geography, we love maps, we love providing insight to decision makers. And, we're more than happy to help if someone comes up with a neat idea or something that would really, make their job easier. I have been in local government space and I've heard from a lot of other communities that GIS staff is often pulled in different directions, but don't let that scare you. Just try to be specific with your needs, try to, be cordial and friendly, and you will find that having, the GIS person on your side is a little like having the IT person on your side. If something goes wrong with your computer, you're gonna get first dibs on priority. So just think about it that way. And I know I just said, I don't think every single person or every single jurisdiction needs a GIS person on staff, but what I will say is consider it, even if it's a part-time person who specializes in GIS, or even if it's someone you bring on when your EOC is activated. Think about how that might look for you. Okay, so questions you can ask yourself about GIS for emergency management. There are a few more considerations for the folks located in EOC. And I've talked a little bit about critical infrastructure already. and how you guys know your communities the best. But if you're new to your jurisdiction, or you're onboarding people, or you're expanding your operations center, you might need to develop some tools or maps that allow people to get up to speed on where things are in your community, where the critical infrastructure is located. Your public works folks or your stormwater folks might not be talking to you, or they might not be talking to each other. And so being a liaison and having that GIS person be the person that sort of collects all that data and consolidates it will give you a much bigger picture of where the important pieces of infrastructure are in your community. And we can also use this to help us train up staff faster. So I think there's something really valuable about providing the maps of a community to a new employee, and saying, here's how the demographics break down. Here is where we know folks tend to be over the age of 65. Here is where we have some mobile home parks. And so in the case of a tornado watch or warning, we need to really be ready to move to those areas, because they might be, more prone to destruction or whatever it is. And so this type of training doesn't really need to be super involved. But if you have a lot of maps, or a half dozen maps even, that explain this to a new person, I think they're going to feel they have a much better sense of the community they're supporting, and they're going to feel a little bit more attached to that community sooner. Okay, so let's talk about some public messaging considerations. We can use those web applications I talked about, or those static maps, as templates to be prepared. So in the case of an emergency, they're ready to go. So for example, when I worked in county government, I knew that if we had an excessive rainfall event, there were at least 3 intersections that would flood every single time. We'd have the road closed signs out there. People shouldn't go down those roads. And so I would have a map kind of ready to go, and I would bring out those closed subdivisions. And when that map was, or when the excessive rainfall event occurred, I would hit share. I would start marking in real time the closed intersections and the closed roads. And then my public messaging, or my public information officer, could do things like share that to social media, share that to the news agencies who were reporting on the event. And that really gives people like, oh man, light bulb, don't take my car down this road because it's flooded. So we can do, quite a little bit ahead of time to be prepared for when the event does occur. And if it's a forecasted event, especially, we can really be prepared so that your PIO has access to things that they can give to reporters or other news agencies. If they can say things like, not only will I give you a quote or a sound bite or whatever it is, but I'll give you some images and some maps that show, where we think impacted areas are going to be, where we've already issued a evacuation order. These are the folks that should be, preparing to leave the area. All of that really helps us create clear, concise messaging so that folks can understand exactly what the ramifications of that event is going to be. We really want to understand what the average person is going to see or think or do in the event of an emergency, and how they're going to respond to the messages you're sending, how they're going to respond to the directions that they're getting from their emergency operations centers, from their leadership. Okay, so I'm gonna stop there. I do think that it's super easy for folks to do this kind of work on their own, right? And so there are some resources I can provide in the chat here about where you can do some free mapping. So if you're just curious about more GIS, you can visit some of these websites and kind of get your hands dirty and kind of explore there a little bit. But other than that, I want to just say thank you for your time today. I hope you learned something about GIS, and I hope you learned about how it could inform your emergency operations planning and your public messaging. And If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Carmi, thank you so much for that great presentation. You're so personable, and I think we have about 26 people on the call. I'm really hoping that someone will want to ask you a question and get some of your great expertise here. We appreciate that you're here. I know personally, I am really grateful for GIS in my car. I'm old enough to remember when I had to write down directions to go somewhere and, was looking on the seat to make sure I was going in the right direction because we had to write down. And now it seems like we can just punch in the address and off we go, right? That's one of the good uses of GIS.
That is definitely a perk of GIS. I'm from the Chicagoland area, so I saw this joke that said, "Oh, you're from the Midwest. I can tell you how to get there, but I can never tell you the address." And I just thought that was so funny. So they'll tell you, go north, go left, turn at the church. But yeah, GPS in our cars has certainly helped us quite a bit.
It's changed our lives.
Hmm.
And I was also thinking that here in New Mexico, we have a lot of mountains and people like to hike. And I guess if they
Yeah.
would have their phone with them and maybe they got lost in the mountains or something, they could be found. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. There has been a couple of cases of folks with Apple Watches that have the Find My device enabled, where they've gotten lost on the trails and their device was what led someone, a rescue team, to them. One person actually fell and their device cracked, their Apple device cracked, but it sent an alert and his daughter was able to find him. So there's definitely some perks to some GIS enabled devices there.
Oh, that's great. And I would think parents of teenagers now they can track their teenagers no matter where they go, right?
Yeah, it's not like
Put
when
that
we
on
were
them.
younger and you had to call and you'd say, "No, I'm at her house. Don't worry."
Oh, I know. Isn't that true? And so Ray Baez says, would you consider joining the SimTech GIS working group? I know I've invited you to that already. So we're
Yes,
sure hoping you'll be a part of that when you're able to do so.
I am excited to join. Thank you.
Good. Are there any other questions that anyone has for Carmela? You might want to take advantage of her expertise. Agnes has something in the chat, but I can't see. It looks like images. So, Agnes, I don't know what that is. Um, but anyway, thank you, Carmi. It's such a pleasure to have you here. You're so personable and just really grateful that you would be here.
Thank you so much for having me. I was so honored to participate. So I hope you enjoyed the lecture. And if you do have any questions for me, my contact information is somewhere on the on the website. You can feel free to reach out.
Right, it is on that speaker list on the app.
Yeah,
So if someone thinks of a question later, please feel free to reach out to Carmi on that. And reminder too, the presentation is recorded. So if you know someone that missed it, and be sure and recommend it to them that they can go back and see it at their convenience. And complete your survey that confirms your attendance. And this is the last session of this day, but there's going to be a lot more presentations tomorrow. And if you can, stay tuned for our social hour. We're going to have a formal night costume party. I don't know what's going to happen with that, but it's going to be fun, I'm sure. So thanks again, Carmela. We just really appreciate it.
thank
Have
you.
have a good evening, everybody. See you later or see you tomorrow.
Bye bye.
Bye.